The sky above the Pacific was calm, too calm. Lieutenant Haruo Sato squinted into the rising sun, his Zero fighter cutting through pale clouds. Below him, the horizon shimmered with steel. Dozens of silhouettes emerged from the mist. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers. An entire American task force moving east. He tightened his grip on the control stick. It couldn't be. Those ships, the markings, the deck layouts, they were the same carriers his squadron claimed to have destroyed months earlier at Pearl Harbor. The same fleet Japan's newspapers said had been reduced to ashes. Through his goggles, Sato saw flight decks alive with movement. Planes lining up, crews waving signals, engines roaring to life. From the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, squadrons of dauntless bombers began to rise, glinting in the morning light. A voice crackled in his headset. Impossible! They were sunk. The fleet Japan had sworn was dead was now alive and coming for revenge. The key. Silence in Sato's cockpit lasted only a heartbeat before the radio filled with panic. In the winter of 1941, Japan stood at the height of its power. The rising sun had stretched across the Pacific, from the coasts of China to the jungles of Southeast Asia. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carriers struck Pearl Harbor on December 7th, the world saw it as the dawn of a new empire. In less than 2 hours, 6 Japanese carriers had unleashed 353 aircraft that turned the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a smoking graveyard. 8 American battleships lay shattered or burning in the shallow harbor. The Arizona had exploded in a single blinding flash, entombing over 1,000 men. Columns of black smoke climbed into the Hawaiian sky as sailors clung to wrecks, oil fires licking the water around them. To the Japanese high command, the message was clear. The United States was broken. Tokyo's streets erupted in celebration. Newspapers printed bold headlines announcing Japan's unstoppable rise. Pilots were paraded as heroes, their names whispered with awe. The Imperial Navy, many believed, had achieved what even the world's greatest powers could not: the destruction of the American fleet in one decisive strike. But beneath the surface of that triumph, a dangerous illusion took root. The Japanese command assumed that America's morale would collapse as swiftly as its ships had burned. They underestimated the industrial heartbeat of a nation that could outbuild and outlast them. Admiral Yamamoto himself had warned them. In private letters, he confessed his unease. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His words went largely ignored. Tokyo's war planners focused on expansion, taking the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. They believed their enemies would need years to recover. In the months that followed, Japanese victories seemed endless. The Imperial Navy swept through the Pacific, its flag raised over island after island. The Kido Butai, Japan's elite carrier force, ruled the seas. The United States appeared helpless to resist. American newspapers filled with stories of losses: Guam, Wake Island, the fall of the Philippines. Each headline felt like another nail in the coffin of American naval power. Yet behind closed doors, far from the burning wrecks of Pearl Harbor, something extraordinary was happening. While Japan celebrated, the United States went silent. The crippled ships were not abandoned. They were studied, salvaged, and resurrected. Engineers, divers, and shipyard crews worked around the clock to raise sunken hulls from the harbor floor. Men who had lost comrades in the attack returned to their stations, welding, hammering, and rebuilding under floodlights. Pearl Harbor transformed overnight into a vast repair yard. The air was filled with the clang of metal, the hiss of torches, the grind of steel plates being replaced. Ship by ship, the Pacific Fleet began to breathe again. The West Virginia, thought to be lost, was slowly refloated. The Nevada, beached after fighting back during the attack, was repaired and modernized. Even the California and Tennessee returned to service. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had made a promise to the nation. "We shall gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God." And behind those words stood an army of engineers, laborers, and sailors turning that vow into steel. By early 1942, America's shipyards were producing at an unimaginable pace. At Puget Sound, Mare Island, and San Francisco, new carriers, Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, joined the fleet. Each month, new destroyers and cruisers rolled off the slips. Factories that once built automobiles now produced engines, propellers, and aircraft parts. Japan had awakened a nation capable not only of fighting back, but of surpassing them in sheer production and ingenuity. Yet the Japanese command continued to believe the enemy was still on its knees. They would learn otherwise, not from reports, but from the roar of engines and the sight of American carriers on the horizon. The illusion of victory was about to shatter. America's silent rebuilding and preparation for revenge. In the wake of Pearl Harbor's devastation, the United States faced a moment that could have defined defeat. Battleships lay half-sunken in the oily waters of Oahu. Aircraft hangars were twisted ruins. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. Yet amid that wreckage, something unbreakable began to form. A quiet, collective resolve. Across the nation, the shock of December 7th ignited a unity no weapon could destroy. Factories ran day and night. Ordinary men and women, many of whom had never seen the ocean, worked to rebuild the Navy that would one day return to the Pacific. Detroit, once the home of automobiles, became an arsenal. Ford's massive Willow Run plant began rolling out B-24 bombers every hour. Shipyards along the West Coast became cities of steel, their cranes clawing at the night sky under blinding floodlights. At Pearl Harbor, the work was relentless. Divers, many of them civilians, operated in near darkness, cutting through wreckage below decks to recover bodies and clear debris. Above them, naval engineers directed one of the greatest salvage operations in history. The goal was not merely to repair ships, it was to bring them back stronger. The Nevada, still scarred from its desperate dash toward open sea during the attack, became a symbol of defiance. Within months it was patched, refitted, and steaming under its own power again. The California and West Virginia followed, both raised from the harbor floor, their decks scrubbed clean of oil and soot. Inside the dry docks, workers painted over bullet holes with new armor plating, replaced burned wiring, and reinforced guns with heavier mounts. Each ship that returned to the fleet carried ghosts, reminders of the men who hadn't. But those memories gave purpose to every hammer strike and every weld. While Japan spread across the Pacific, American engineers and admirals quietly laid the foundation for a counterstrike. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, took command on December 31, 1941. When he arrived at Pearl Harbor, the air still smelled of oil and smoke. He walked the piers in silence, studying the wrecks. "The Japanese did us a favor," he later said. "They destroyed our battleships, but they left our fuel tanks, repair yards, and submarines untouched. That oversight would cost Japan dearly." From the ashes of the battleship era, a new doctrine emerged: carrier warfare. With much of the old fleet disabled, the U.S. Navy placed its hopes on the floating airfields that had survived the attack: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. These carriers became the striking arm of America's comeback. Pilots trained ceaselessly in the skies over the Pacific, perfecting dive bombing and torpedo tactics that would soon decide battles. Mechanics learned to turn damaged planes around in minutes. Every lesson was bought with blood, but it shaped a new generation of naval warfare, one that valued speed Coordination and air supremacy over sheer armor. Back home, Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy gathered unstoppable momentum. Steel mills in Pittsburgh and Bethlehem glowed red through the night. The Clyde shipyard in San Francisco worked around the clock, producing escort ships faster than Japan could sink them. American industry was no longer just recovering. It was expanding into something Japan could not match. By the spring of 1942, new ships were sliding into the water every week. The Yorktown returned from the Atlantic, refitted and ready. The brand-new Hornet joined the fleet. Even the Enterprise, already a veteran, was reinforced for what lay ahead. In April, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, 16 B-25 bombers lifted off from the deck of the Hornet in a daring mission that would shock Japan, the Doolittle Raid. It was a symbolic strike, more psychological than strategic, but it proved that America was no longer on the defensive. Tokyo had been bombed. The tide was beginning to shift. Every nail driven, every ship launched, and every pilot trained pointed toward one goal: revenge. The United States was no longer rebuilding for survival. It was preparing to return, to hunt the same fleet that had once humiliated it. And that return would come sooner than anyone expected. Tactical and strategic angles of America's naval comeback. The American response to Pearl Harbor was not just emotional. It was methodical. Every setback was dissected. Every weakness turned into a weapon. In the months that followed, the United States Navy began to rethink warfare itself. For decades, battleships had ruled the seas. Their thick armor and massive guns defined naval power. But Pearl Harbor exposed a brutal truth. The age of the battleship was over. The Japanese had proved that aircraft carriers could destroy an entire fleet from hundreds of miles away. America learned the lesson quickly, and instead of clinging to tradition, it adapted. Admiral Nimitz and his staff began designing a new kind of navy, one built around mobility, range, and deception. The carrier became the centerpiece. Instead of engaging head-on, fleets would now fight beyond the horizon, using air power to strike first and vanish before the enemy could respond. The Americans also restructured command systems. Before the war, naval operations had been fragmented, with poor communication between units. Now, task forces were built around individual carriers, self-sufficient battle groups capable of striking anywhere, anytime. Each had its own escorts, supply ships, and reconnaissance planes. This decentralization meant the loss of one ship would no longer cripple the entire fleet. Training intensified. In the waters off Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast, pilots flew endless drills in formation, flying, dive bombing, and torpedo attacks. They practiced under simulated combat conditions, sometimes using live ammunition. Every pilot learned not only to attack, but to coordinate, to time waves of aircraft with precision, so that Japanese defenses would be overwhelmed from multiple directions. This level of coordination was new to naval warfare. The Japanese, though formidable, often operated under rigid command structures. Their pilots were elite, but their tactics relied heavily on pre-planned attacks and strict discipline. American commanders encouraged flexibility, allowing pilots to adapt mid-battle, to seize openings without waiting for orders. Equally important was intelligence. The Navy's cryptanalysts, the code breakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, began to crack the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. It was a slow, painstaking process, but by spring 1942, they were reading fragments of Japanese communications. The Americans could now anticipate movements that Japan believed were secret. This intelligence edge would soon prove decisive. Meanwhile, logistics, often overlooked in war, became America's hidden weapon. Japan's empire stretched across vast oceans, but its supply lines were thin. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, had to cross thousands of miles from the home islands. The United States, on the other hand, built a global supply network. Floating dry docks, mobile repair ships, and refueling tankers followed the fleet. By the time a battle was over, the next wave of ships was already fueled, repaired, and ready. Even tactics at sea evolved with American innovation. Radar, once experimental, became a game-changer. American carriers and cruisers were fitted with radar systems that could detect approaching planes hours before they were visible. Japanese formations, accustomed to surprise, now found themselves walking into prepared ambushes. The psychological shift was just as profound. For the first time, American sailors believed they could face the Imperial Navy on equal terms. The fear that had haunted them after Pearl Harbor began to fade. In its place grew something colder: focus. They no longer fought to defend. They fought to prove that Pearl Harbor had not broken them. Each carrier that joined the Pacific Fleet represented a tactical advantage Japan could not easily counter. The Enterprise and Hornet became symbols of mobility and precision. The Yorktown, though damaged, returned to sea after lightning-fast repairs. Together, they would form the backbone of a new kind of warfare. One that relied on speed, coordination, and information. And soon, this rebuilt fleet would face its first true test at a place called Midway. Human and technological angles. The men, the machines, and the spirit behind the comeback war is often measured in steel, firepower, and tonnage. But behind every ship, every aircraft, and every plan stood people. Ordinary Americans who refused to let defeat define them. When the Pacific Fleet was at its weakest, it wasn't admirals or politicians who first carried the burden of recovery. It was the welders in Pearl Harbor's dry docks, the women assembling bombers in California, and the mechanics who worked through exhaustion under the glare of floodlights. They were not soldiers, yet their hands rebuilt the war machine that would change the course of history. In Honolulu, shipyard workers worked 12-hour shifts without complaint. They patched hulls, replaced gun turrets, and rewired entire ships by hand. Oil still floated on the water, the air thick with the smell of diesel and smoke. Each spark from a welder's torch was a reminder that the fleet was coming back to life. Farther east, in factories across the mainland, innovation surged. Engineers refined aircraft designs that could outfly and outfight the Japanese Zero. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, though slower, could absorb punishment and survive dogfights that would destroy a lighter plane. The newer F-6F Hellcat, still in testing at the time, promised unmatched durability. America's advantage wasn't just in invention, but in adaptation. The same spirit extended to the pilots. Many of those who would soon take off from the decks of Enterprise or Hornet had been civilians less than a year earlier. They came from farms, small towns, and city streets. Volunteers who learned to fly, navigate, and fight in record time. Their instructors drilled them with relentless precision. How to land on a moving carrier deck, how to control panic under fire, how to dive through clouds of anti-aircraft shells. Each training flight carried the weight of Pearl Harbor. The men didn't speak much about revenge, but they carried it in their silence, in the way they studied maps, memorized enemy formations, and double-checked every control. They were determined to return to the same waters where so many of their friends had died. Not as victims, but as avengers. Technological innovation also gave the Americans an edge. Ship designers introduced damage control systems that turned ships into floating fortresses. Compartments could be sealed instantly after a hit, preventing fires from spreading. New fire suppression systems used foam instead of water, extinguishing oil fires that once doomed entire crews. The Navy also invested in coordination between sea and air. Radios improved, allowing real-time communication between pilots and carriers. Reconnaissance planes mapped enemy positions with unprecedented accuracy. For the first time, the ocean was no longer a void. It was a battlefield that could be read, calculated, and mastered. But beyond tactics and machines, there was something intangible: morale. Every sailor aboard the newly repaired Nevada or West Virginia carried a personal reason to fight. Some had survived the flames at Pearl Harbor. Others had lost brothers or friends. When they looked at the bullet holes still visible in the bulkheads, they didn't see weakness. They saw a promise that those ships would sail again, not as symbols of loss, but as instruments of justice. Even the Japanese would later remark on the spirit they faced. Pilots who had fought at Pearl Harbor would soon encounter the same ships they believed destroyed, now rebuilt, faster, and deadlier than before. To them, it seemed almost supernatural, as if the enemy they thought buried beneath the waves had risen from the deep. This fusion of human endurance and industrial innovation became America's greatest weapon. No single admiral or machine defined it. It was the collective will of a nation that refused to stay defeated. By May 1942, the transformation was complete. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was smaller than Japan's, but faster, more flexible, and driven by a single idea: the next battle will be ours. And that battle was about to begin. On a small, windswept island in the middle of the Pacific, where the reborn fleet would face its enemy head-on. The Battle of Midway, the moment. Japan realized the fleet was back June 4, 1942. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting gold over the endless blue of the Central Pacific. The island of Midway, a small, flat atoll barely 6 square kilometers wide, sat alone in the ocean, quiet except for the distant rumble of approaching aircraft. For Japan, this was meant to be the final blow. Operation MI, the invasion of Midway, was designed to draw out and destroy what remained of the U.S. Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned it meticulously. Japan would strike the island, lure the American carriers into a trap, and end the Pacific War before the United States could recover. What Yamamoto didn't know was that his secret wasn't a secret anymore. At Station Haipo in Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers had intercepted and decrypted enough of the Japanese naval code JN-25 to predict the attack. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his small team of linguists and analysts had identified AF, the target in the Japanese orders, as Midway. When the message was confirmed through a clever ruse involving a false report about a broken water system, Admiral Nimitz knew exactly where and when the Japanese would strike. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans would not be caught by surprise. They would be waiting. Nimitz deployed every available carrier: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Together they formed Task Forces 16 and 17 under Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher. Their combined air groups totaled fewer than 230 aircraft, outnumbered more than 2-to-1 by the Japanese fleet, which approached with 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. As dawn broke, Japanese bombers attacked Midway Island, setting fuel tanks ablaze and cratering the runways. The island's defenders fired back with anti-aircraft guns, black puffs dotting the sky. To the Japanese airmen, it looked like another easy victory. Their carriers began to rearm and refuel aircraft for a second strike, unaware that American carriers were already within range. Hidden beyond the horizon, at 7:10 a.m. was Sintus Timad feeds. Radar on Midway picked up incoming aircraft, not Japanese, but American. The first U.S. attacks came from the island's airfields, a desperate mix of marine dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. Most were shot down before reaching their targets, but they forced the Japanese to delay their next strike and kept their decks occupied. Every minute bought by those doomed squadrons was priceless. By mid-morning, American carrier planes arrived, uncoordinated, exhausted, and flying at the edge of their fuel limits. The torpedo squadrons from Hornet and Enterprise went in first, attacking at low altitude. They flew straight into a storm of anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fighters. Of 41 planes, 35 were shot down. Not one torpedo hit, but their sacrifice changed everything. At 10:20 a.m., as Japanese decks were covered with refueling aircraft and armed bombs, the sky above them suddenly filled with shadows. High above, 3 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared, guided by luck, instinct, and a final radio call from a lost pilot who had stumbled across the Japanese fleet. The dive bombers rolled over and plunged. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning. Bombs tore through their decks, igniting fuel lines and detonating torpedoes stored below. Explosions ripped the ships apart. Sailors leaped into the sea as flames swallowed the decks. The pride of the Imperial Navy, the same carriers that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, were now crippled beyond recovery. On the surviving carrier, Hiryu, Vice Admiral Taman Yamaguchi launched a counterstrike. His planes hit the Yorktown, crippling her with 2 bomb strikes. Yet even that wasn't enough. By afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and delivered the same fate. 2 direct hits that turned her into an inferno. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. More than 3,000 sailors and airmen were dead or missing. Japan's carrier force, the elite Kido Butai that had once terrorized the Pacific, was annihilated. For the Japanese pilots who survived, disbelief replaced pride. The fleet they thought they had destroyed had returned, rebuilt, rearmed, and guided by intelligence and innovation they had never imagined. For America, Midway was not just a victory. It was vindication. The Japanese radar operators aboard Zuikaku couldn't believe what they were seeing. The echoes on their scopes were unmistakable. Large, steady, powerful. An entire fleet was advancing from the east. Reports flooded in from scouts. Multiple aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers moving in formation. Yet many of those names, Yorktown, Hornet, Enterprise, had been struck from Japanese records months, even years ago. To the men aboard Zuikaku, it felt like the dead had returned. On the horizon, the rising sun met the silhouettes of U.S. carriers, their decks crowded with aircraft ready for launch. The engines roared to life, one after another, shaking the steel beneath them. Among them was USS Essex, leading a new generation of fleet carriers, accompanied by the rebuilt Yorktown II, Lexington II, and Bunker Hill. The Ghost Fleet was no myth. It was real, rebuilt in America's massive shipyards, forged from lessons learned at Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz. At dawn, the air erupted with sound. Hundreds of American planes lifted off in synchronized waves, Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers. They climbed into the sky, their propellers slicing through the humid Pacific air, engines echoing like vengeance carried by the wind. For the Japanese lookouts, the sight was both magnificent and horrifying. A wall of aircraft stretching as far as the eye could see, moving with mechanical precision toward their position. Admiral Ozawa, Japan's last great carrier commander, stood on the bridge of Zuikaku. His face was calm, almost stoic, but inside he knew the truth. The Imperial Navy no longer had the strength to match what was coming. His fleet was a decoy now, meant to lure the Americans north while another Japanese force attempted to strike the landing beaches at Leyte. Yet the Americans were not fooled. Their reconnaissance, guided by superior radar and intelligence, had seen through the plan. Ozawa's fleet was walking into its own destruction. At 8 a.m., radar aboard USS Lexington picked up incoming bogies. Japanese planes, fewer than 100, were closing in from the northwest. They were veteran pilots, some survivors from the early years of the war. They flew Zeros, once the terror of the Pacific, now hopelessly outmatched by the faster, more durable Hellcats. The sky turned into a swirling arena of fire and smoke. Tracers cut across the blue like red comets, and falling aircraft left spiraling trails of black smoke that sank toward the ocean. Within minutes, over half of Ozawa's strike group was gone. Those who survived turned back, their mission shattered before reaching the enemy carriers. The Japanese air arm, once the pride of the empire, was dying in front of their eyes. The Americans, however, pressed forward relentlessly. Their counterstrikes were devastating. Coordinated waves of bombers descended upon the Japanese fleet with mathematical precision. At 10:25 a.m., the first bombs struck Zuikaku. The carrier that had launched the planes at Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier was now engulfed in flames. The deck buckled, planes exploded where they stood, and sailors scrambled to control the fires. Ozawa stood firm, giving his final orders. When it became clear that Zuikaku would not survive, he ordered the rising sun flag to be lowered, a gesture of honor, a final salute to a ship that had carried Japan's hopes across half the world. As she began to list, a Japanese officer whispered, "The Ghost Fleet has returned for us." One by one, Japan's carriers were struck. Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, each consumed by fire. The sea was littered with oil, debris, and the wreckage of aircraft. By noon, the air was thick with smoke and silence, broken only by the distant rumble of American engines circling above. The battle off Cape Engano, as it would later be called, ended not just with the loss of ships, but with the symbolic end of Japan's carrier power. The men who had once delivered the Empire's greatest victories now watched their fleet burn beneath a merciless sky. From the deck of USS Enterprise, American sailors stood quietly, watching the plumes of smoke rise on the horizon. Many of them remembered the early days, the shock of Pearl Harbor, the desperate defense at Midway. Now, as flames consumed the last of Japan's great carriers, they understood something deeper. The war had come full circle. The fleet that Japan thought it had destroyed was back, stronger than before, and it had brought history's reckoning with it. As the last of the Japanese carriers slipped beneath the waves, Admiral Halsey's radio operators recorded a single coded message sent from the American flagship to all units. "The job is finished here. The enemy's air arm is gone. But the battle's true cost, in men, in machines, in memory, was still unfolding across the Pacific." And as the smoke settled, one question lingered quietly over the waves. What did this victory mean for the balance of power, and for the thousands of Japanese soldiers still fighting across the islands of the Pacific? The sea was calm again, deceptively so. Hours earlier it had been alive with fire, noise, and fury. But now it was silent, broken only by the sound of waves striking twisted metal. Oil slicks shimmered on the water like black mirrors, reflecting the smoke that drifted across the horizon. The once proud Zuikaku had vanished beneath the Pacific, taking more than 800 men with her. Around her, lifeboats floated quietly, filled with wounded sailors staring blankly toward the distant sky. American rescue crews moved among the wreckage, pulling survivors from the water. Many of them were Japanese, young, exhausted, and shivering from the cold. They said little. Some bowed their heads as they were lifted aboard U.S. destroyers, unable to meet the eyes of their captors. The Americans treated them with a professionalism that surprised many prisoners. There was no celebration, no laughter. They knew this victory carried a heavy price. For Admiral Ozawa's decoy fleet, the loss was absolute. All 4 of his carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, were gone. Japan's naval air power, once the most feared in the world, was now functionally extinct. In total, the Imperial Navy lost over 400 aircraft and nearly 1,000 men in a single day. By contrast, the U.S. Task Force 38 lost only 40 planes and a handful of pilots. It was not a battle. It was an execution. When reports reached Tokyo, the reaction was subdued. There was no announcement, no heroic propaganda. Japan's high command understood the truth. The empire had no ships left to defend its waters. The carriers that had once symbolized power and reach had become ghosts of their own legend. Without them, Japan's remaining forces were trapped, isolated across scattered islands, cut off from supplies, and left to fight alone. For the Americans, the triumph at Cape Engano was both strategic and psychological. It confirmed what many had already sensed. Japan was now fighting a defensive war it could no longer win. The U.S. Navy had grown into an unstoppable machine. 99 carriers strong by late 1944, with a replacement system that could rebuild a sunken ship in months. Every loss the Japanese suffered was permanent. Every loss the Americans faced was temporary. But the victory came at a moral cost. Among the sailors of Halsey's fleet, there was pride, but not joy. Many had fought since 1942, watching friends die at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. Seeing the Japanese fleet finally destroyed brought closure, but also a strange emptiness. The war was turning into something mechanical, a relentless process of destruction without end in sight. Letters from sailors that week reflected that mood. One American pilot wrote home, "We did what had to be done, but it doesn't feel like winning anymore. It feels like burying ghosts." Across the Pacific, the Japanese survivors who made it back to shore faced silence. There were no medals or parades. Some were assigned to base defense, others to suicide missions that would come months later. The Imperial Navy had no fuel, no planes, and soon, no purpose. In just 3 years, the force that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor was now reduced to fragments scattered across the ocean floor. Yet, amid the ruins, a strange respect lingered between enemies. When U.S. intelligence later examined Ozawa's final orders, they found a note he had dictated before battle. "We will engage the enemy with what remains. If we fall, it will be as sailors of the Emperor, and as men who kept faith with their ships." That single line was passed quietly among American officers who had fought him. It reminded them that, even in defeat, courage had not vanished from the sea. The Americans had achieved revenge, complete and unquestionable. But as they prepared for the next phase of the war, toward Leyte and beyond, one truth became clear. Revenge did not end wars. It only carried them forward. The flames of Cape Engano had burned away Japan's naval strength. But the war's darkest days were still ahead. On land, across the islands where soldiers fought without surrender. In the months that followed the battle off Cape Engano, the Pacific seemed to grow quieter. But it was the silence of exhaustion, not peace. The Japanese Navy, once a titan of the oceans, now existed only in fragments. A few cruisers and destroyers remained, scattered between Singapore, Formosa, and the home islands. They lacked fuel, pilots, and purpose. The Imperial fleet that had sailed so proudly across the Pacific in 1941 was now gone, its power broken by the very nation it had once sought to destroy. For Japan's surviving admirals, the reports were unbearable to read. They spoke of burned carriers, lost air wings, and pilots who never returned. The names that had once filled Japanese propaganda broadcasts, Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, Zuikaku, were now epitaphs in naval history. Each ship's loss marked a chapter in a long, inevitable decline. In Tokyo, even the most loyal officers began to question the meaning of victory. The idea of the Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet battle Japan had spent decades preparing for, had ended in ruin. The Americans had not only outbuilt them, but outthought them, turning industrial might into tactical supremacy. Japan's once superior training could no longer compensate for its lack of resources, radar, and experienced pilots. The Imperial Navy tried to fight on, but its operations became symbolic gestures rather than strategic actions. Ships were ordered into suicidal missions, like the final sortie of the battleship Yamato in April 1945, a desperate attempt to strike the American invasion fleet off Okinawa. It never made it. Waves of U.S. aircraft sank the giant vessel in just 2 hours. More than 3,000 men went down with her. The ocean, once Japan's greatest weapon, had become its grave. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy's momentum only grew. With every battle, it became faster, larger, and more coordinated. By the end of 1944, American shipyards were launching a new carrier every few weeks. The skies over the Pacific were filled with swarms of Hellcats and Avengers, while submarines hunted Japanese shipping lanes without mercy. The shift in power was so absolute that even American commanders were stunned by its scale. Admiral Halsey later reflected that by late 1944, we no longer fought an enemy navy. We fought wreckage and courage. For the Japanese people, the collapse of the fleet carried deep symbolic weight. The Navy had been the pride of the empire, the force that had defended Japan's honor since the days of Admiral Togo and the victory at Tsushima in 1905. Its destruction was not just a military loss, it was a spiritual one. The fall of the carriers meant the loss of Japan's shield and its myth of invincibility. In the ruins of Yokosuka and Kure, sailors now worked dismantling their own ships for scrap. Engines were stripped for parts, steel melted down for desperate home defense efforts. The empire was preparing for an invasion it could no longer repel, but in the United States, the tone was shifting. The vengeance that had fueled the war's early years was giving way to reflection. Newspapers printed images of burned Japanese ships and wrote headlines about "Revenge for Pearl Harbor." Yet within the ranks of the Navy, the mood was more subdued. Commanders knew that the destruction of Japan's fleet meant the war was entering its most brutal phase, one that would move from the sea to the cities. The victory at Cape Engano had achieved what strategy alone could not. It erased Japan's ability to fight at sea. But it also revealed something about the nature of war itself. That power, once lost, cannot be regained by courage alone. The Japanese pilots who had once ruled the skies now flew on one-way missions. The admirals who had planned great offensives now prayed simply to protect their homeland. As 1945 began, Japan's last fleet faded into memory. The oceans that had once carried its dreams of empire now carried only silence and debris. Yet, within that silence, history left a final echo. A reminder that domination built on destruction always ends the same way, in ruins scattered across an indifferent sea. The Pacific today is vast and quiet, a mirror of blue stretching endlessly in every direction. Beneath its surface lie the remains of ships that once carried the weight of nations, of men who believed they were shaping the future of the world. The sea has claimed them all, indifferent to who won or lost. For the Americans, the return of the fleet after Pearl Harbor was more than military triumph. It was proof that resilience could turn devastation into purpose. From the ashes of their broken ships, they built a navy stronger than any in history, guided not by revenge alone, but by determination to never be caught unprepared again. For Japan, the same ocean that once carried glory became a teacher of humility. Its admirals and pilots learned that courage cannot outlast exhaustion, and that brilliance fades when pride refuses to adapt. Their defeat was not just tactical, it was the collapse of an idea. That spirit alone could defy industrial might. Yet, in a way, both sides were united by the same truth. The sea takes everything eventually. Flags fade, empires dissolve, and ships become rusted shadows resting on the ocean floor. What endures are the stories of men who faced impossible odds, of innovation born from tragedy, of nations forced to grow through loss. The Japanese pilots who couldn't believe the fleet they sank had returned were witnessing more than a naval resurgence. They were witnessing history correcting itself, the moment when arrogance met endurance, and endurance prevailed. Today, divers exploring the wrecks at Midway, Leyte, and Cape Engano find silence where chaos once ruled. The Pacific holds no grudges. It simply remembers, quietly, endlessly, the lessons written in steel and fire. And as the waves roll on, they whisper the same truth to anyone who listens. Strength fades, power shifts, but memory endures forever.